to meet me. Blossom or snow, may you bloom and grow, bloom and grow forever. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, every morning you greet me.
Small
and white,
clean
and bright, you look happy to meet me. Blossom or snow, may you bloom and grow, bloom and grow forever. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever.
Wow. Campbell sang that song at Barrie's bedside the night before he died. And that was also his grandson, Malcolm. Such music, a great common love between them. What a way to be delivered across the veil, eh? The angels on the other side will have a hard time competing with that. But such beauty is fitting and appropriate for this day as we gather in this space that is made sacred by the presence of friendship and love that you all bring, to say goodbye and to celebrate the life of a very good man, Robert Alexander Barrie Dunsmore, a dear husband, father, grandfather, brother, colleague, friend, who has now found rest for his soul. You are welcome to grieve in this time the absence of Barrie in your life and in the world. And you are also welcome to laugh and to remember and with joy to account for the gift that was each of ours to have known and loved Barrie in distinct and treasured ways. And as we gather here today with gratitude for his life, we also commend him to God at his death, proclaiming the truth that Jesus Christ died to reveal, that the last word in this world is not death. The last word is always life. And so Barrie's life continues not only in the DNA of Tim, Leanne, Campbell, Alex, Malcolm, Meredith, Paige, and those still to come in the Dunsmore clan, but also in the lives of those of us who knew and loved him. His spirit of generosity and honesty, of integrity and humility is a part of each of us. But the immortal nature of life is more than that, because this world is God's eternal realm. And we can catch glimpses of this eternal realm beyond as well while we are here. But it is there where many rooms have been prepared, and it is there where Barrie has been received, and it is there where all people will gather one day in understanding and peace. Knowing this, let us enter into the gate of this hour and be very present to Barrie, even as he is present to us in God's Spirit. Let us pray. O God, you have shown us and promised us that love is endless, that life is eternal, and that death is only a horizon which is nothing save the limit of our sight. Lift us up in this hour that we may see more clearly. Draw us ever closer to yourself so that we may know ourselves nearer to Barrie, who is held in your Spirit. Bless this time together that the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts will be rich and worthy, honoring the life and legacy of Barrie Dunsmore, whose life knows no end in you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I'd now like to invite you to please stand and join us for a hymn that is printed on the inside of the program, Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer. Guide me, O thou great Redeemer, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me now and evermore. Feed me now and evermore. Open now the crystal fountain, whence the healing stream doth flow. Let the fire and cloudy pillar lead me all my journey through. Strong deliverer, be thou still my strength and shield. Be thou still my strength and shield. When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Death of death and hell's destruction, land me safe on Canaan's side. Songs of praises, I will ever give to thee. I will ever give to thee. Please be seated.
The two scriptures I will be reading from today were found written out and tucked into an old Bible that was given to Barrie by his mother, Margaret Campbell Dunsmore, known to many as Daisy. They were also read at her funeral in 1992. The first passage comes from the Old Testament, Psalm 118. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. Shouts of joy and victory resound in the tents of the righteous. The Lord's right hand has done mighty things. I will not die but live and will proclaim what the Lord has done. Open for me the gates of righteousness, and I shall enter in and give thanks to God. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this on this very day. Let us rejoice today and be glad. And the second reading comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 14, as Jesus says to his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." The word of the Lord.
Before I turn the mic over to a number of people who will reflect upon Barrie, I want to take an opportunity to say how honored I am that Barrie's family asked me to come down to lead this service, for I was very moved to hear of Barrie's death. I was so fortunate to have Barrie in my little country congregational church in Vermont, which was my first pastorate where I served for 15 years. And Barrie was there for much of that time. And I knew that Barrie was a bigwig newsman, and that I remembered him from the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reporting on that. But very quickly to me, I kind of lost a sense of that, because he was this down-to-earth, generous, perceptive man who came to worship, who visited with me to have intense spiritual conversations, served as a deacon in our church, and occasionally I would convince him to read scripture with his beautifully resonant voice, which left you feeling like whatever he read, that the truth had been spoken. I was touched that and amazed that one with such experience and knowledge, who was on the world stage for so many years, had the humility to be present and receptive and appreciative to me as a new pastor in this little church. He was one of the key people early on who affirmed me and my ministry and encouraged me to believe I had something of worth and value to offer. And this is who Barrie was as a man. A great and discerning mind on one hand, and a good and generous heart on the other. A man with an incredibly broad sense of the world and her affairs, and an intimate attention and sensitivity to the people right around him. A man who could parse into a few understandable paragraphs very complex world events and ponder with a young pastor the open-ended mysteries of God. A man who could talk in one breath about his experience covering the Middle East peace process, and in the other, with a twinkle in his eye, brag about what his wife, Whitney, and his children and his grandchildren were up to. A man who insisted on fairness and honesty and right action on a global political scale, and a man who was concerned about the well-being of the person sitting across the living room from him, which I remember doing vividly as the last conversation I had with Barrie on this beautiful late summer Vermont afternoon. And it was then that we said farewell to each other as I left for my church to serve a new church in Massachusetts, and he left to be closer to his family down here in D.C. There aren't many men who strike such balances, honesty, faith, honestly, faithfully, humbly, but Barrie did. And as is the case with how the Spirit works in such people's lives, those around him, like myself, were the better for it. Jesus said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." This is a good word for us this day in this country as we say goodbye to Barrie, feeling maybe that the world can't afford right now to be losing. Feeling, as we say goodbye to him, maybe that the world can't afford to be losing right now such a clear, honest, good person on the stage of the nation. But Jesus says, do not be troubled, reminding us that the truth of the matter is that deeper streams of wisdom, greater currents of love, more powerful tides of goodness ultimately sustain this blessed world. That is how God made this world to be. Our work, as was Barrie's work, is to doggedly align ourselves to those currents of truth and goodness, and trust God that in the end, good wins out, which is what Barrie knows fully now, even as he is fully known. Amen? Amen. Barrie was a multifaceted man, which is something of an understatement, and so I'd love to open the floor right now, and we'll hear from some voices who will give you a greater sense of that, as you must already know. And we'll begin with Senator Leahy.
Thank you. Marcel and I wanted to be here and give our love to Whitney and Timothy, Leanne, Campbell. We've known us all her life, and children, grandchildren. And Reverend, I couldn't help but think, when you mentioned Barrie's voice, I looked at this picture, how many times I've heard him either in person or on the phone saying to me, something's coming, have you considered? You know what's coming next? No, I hadn't, but I will now, Barrie, let me tell you. And he guaranteed I did. So it's great to be here with all of you, this community of foreign correspondents. We Vermonters have been proud to claim Barrie and Whitney as Vermonters in the last chapter of his storied life. And it's not lost on us when we look at his origins in Canada. We Vermonters in that little state, we think of Canada as that giant to the north. But we're just a couple of the countless Americans and countless Vermonters whose lives were brightened by having known him. We've been enriched, enlightened, and trust me, sometimes challenged by his perceptive commentary. He shared his experience, his sharp insights, a remarkable career that spanned the globe. And he had a great sense of history, and that is often missing today. I look forward to each of his essays. Everybody in my office got used to getting a note, you got to read this. A number of other senators got the same note. The Congressional Record got to have many of them. In fact, in 2015, I was going back and preparing for this, I found the record and the Iraq War's impact on current national security threats. Saying to David Carl, we should have paid more attention to that. At another time of national debate and decision, he was saying, wouldn't it be nice to think of our history? And in tribute to Barrie this week in Vermont's Rutland Herald, had published a lot of his commentaries, his editor, Barrie's editor, David Moults, was a Pulitzer Prize-winning former editorial page writer. And Whitney and I were talking about this editorial earlier. Here's what he said. Week by week, stories emerged of astonishing things he had seen or done, revealed in a modestly offhand way. To say that Barrie Dunsmore was a consummate newsman is to say something important in a time when the idea of news, facts, and truth are under attack from demagogues trying to manipulate them to their advantage. Being there mattered, and getting it right mattered too, unquote. Well, his essays were as fresh as the day's headline. I remember back in January, he wrote about certain attacks being made on Colin Kaepernick. And what could be more timely than his essays, especially this past year, on the freedom of the press? Now, he reported from totalitarian outposts. I was intrigued to hear his stories about those. And it shocked him. It concerned him to the core to hear in our country attacks that he'd heard in totalitarian countries about the press as the enemy of the people. Smears and lies like that, he said, are the most damaging to the very essence of American democracy. He knew that criticism of those in government, all of us, was not a crime. He actually read the First Amendment. And perhaps some of us who hold office ought to read, if it's for the first time, or if we've read it before, reread it. He knew it. And far-flung posts can be difficult in living and working conditions, even more difficult to explain to Americans. But he did that in the concise language of broadcasting. Ted, we were talking about this the other day. His reports have sometimes been called elegant dispatches. He's able to explain complex, interrelated global issues in plain language and descriptions that everyone could understand. He was a workhorse. Although I must admit, the best dressed workhorse I ever saw on television. So I admired Barrie for what he's done, for what he's seen, what he experienced, how through his reporting he helped us all to better understand complex, interrelated global issues. I admired him for who he was. I admired him for his decency, for his unending curiosity. He always wanted to understand and learn more. And I'll close with this, and it's quoted on the back of your book. He said, "Here is a dirty little secret that I discovered after spending much of my adult life living abroad, reporting from many of the countries of the world. Human beings are remarkably similar. I take issue only in this. Barrie, you are remarkably extraordinary." Thank you.
All of the Dunsmore family that I have not met yet. Hi. Once upon a time, I had a very small degree of power. As director of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, I could select the 6 fellows who would join us each semester, each then responsible for researching and writing a paper about the many ways networks and newspapers helped fashion the public policy of the nation. For the 1995 fall semester, I selected Barrie to be one of our 6 fellows, and I was thrilled when he accepted. I wanted an experienced foreign correspondent, one who'd covered wars and diplomacy. Barrie had done that and more for 30 years. He was the consummate pro, who not only looked the part, trench coat and all, but was also a wonderfully decent, honorable colleague, capable of sharing his experience with students, which he loved doing, and I could see they loved and respected him. For his paper, Barrie chose a complicated subject, one difficult for the journalist and the general then as now. He called it "The Next War Live." He read the existing literature, of course, found there wasn't much of it, and plunged into interviewing 31 key officials, including Generals Shalikashvili, Powell, Schwarzkopf, and then many prominent journalists, including TV anchors Brokaw, Jennings, Rather, Shaw, and Koppel. And he delved as well into his own deep reservoir of experience and knowledge, and he produced a superb paper explaining the technical, military, and political complexities involved in covering a war live. The generals were remarkably candid with Barrie. They respected him, as well they should. They appreciated the need to win public support for a war, and they were clearly struggling to come up with guidelines that were acceptable to the press and the public. Powell told Barrie that if he felt the TV cameras were in any way jeopardizing his troops, he'd, quote, arrest the reporters and lock them up. Now, that phrase is, anyway, unquote, and he was positive that the public would support his decision. Barrie, it turned out, was impressed by that argument. Interestingly, the TV anchors were not of one mind about live coverage of a war. Brokaw had his doubts, concerned that perhaps live coverage could in one way or another endanger the lives of troops. Koppel told Barrie that if there was a declared war, the government, urging common sense, national unity, had the right to bar cameras from the battlefield. Rather, on the other hand, said that cameras in the hands of very experienced reporters could produce excellent and important journalism, and he pointed to the 4 days of the Kennedy assassination to prove his point. Barrie, always fair-minded, always careful, balanced what he had heard from his sources against his own experience, and concluded, and I remember he concluded this very reluctantly, but he did conclude, that any administration would be driven naturally to impose severe restrictions on live coverage of the next war. Barrie argued that live coverage was not protected by the First Amendment. It was not essential to the practice of what we call good journalism, and it was hardly synonymous with that wonderful phrase, the public's right to know. I was proud to publish that paper in March 1996, Kennedy School discussion paper D22, look it up. Read it, learn from it, and also in the process learn about Barrie. He was not a scholar. He had not spent a great deal of time at a university, but he had the scholar's commitment to fact, to research, to interviewing, all of the essential tools, not only of scholarship, but also of first-class journalism, which he exhibited throughout his professional life. And then from retirement to the tail end of his life, when he lived in Vermont and then in Washington, he wrote short essays about contemporary affairs, foreign and domestic policy. They were serious, very personal essays, the sort that good pamphleteers in the latter part of the 18th century, during the American Revolution, used to write, and of course, Thomas Paine's name came immediately to mind whenever I would read them. I think those essays should have appeared in the Times and the Post, but how enriching they were for those of us who received them through the marvels of the internet. And for both me and Barrie, the challenge of writing about the Trump era posed a particular problem. After a lifetime of just reporting the news without fear or favor, as the Times used to say, we found ourselves in telephone conversations, mostly in email exchanges, not enough in personal exchange. We found ourselves compelled for different reasons to inject our own feeling and opinions into our work. We'd never done that before, perhaps even rarely, but now we felt we had to. We both felt so strongly that the president was undermining not just the press and the judicial system, in other words, the very foundations of our democracy, we felt an obligation to speak up. Barrie in his essays, me in a new book here and there, an op-ed, Barrie often returned to that central theme in our talks, that when a president demeans the press, he demeans our democracy. Barrie challenged Trump with insight, eloquent language, energy, and class. Toward the end, we kept making plans about seeing each other more often than we ended up doing. Various problems, doctor appointments, family obligations, the many problems of aging, being only some of the reasons. But we emailed and we talked on the phone, and we kept the flame alive. And I would like to suggest a final thought, which is mostly for Whitney and Barrie's children and family. It's something that I remember most centrally when I think about Barrie. He and I were competitors. After all, he worked at ABC and I at CBS and for a time at NBC. And maybe competitors are supposed to put banana peels in one another's way, but we did not. After we filed our stories, each of us trying in his own way to write a better story than the competitor, that went without saying. But when we were finished, generally on long trips, we'd often have dinner together. I remember them as warm, pleasant, funny, delightful times when we shared our insights into the fascinating personalities that we had covered that day. Very important people, but ordinary people. About the history of the places that we'd been to, about the twists and turns of American diplomacy. Remember, this was after we filed. After we were no longer competitors, we were friends, colleagues, journalists just trying to do the best job that we could. I shall miss Barrie very much. He was a class act.
Well, it's most appropriate that Marvin ended as he did. And while he and I talk often, we did not collaborate on this. But I begin by saying that Barrie and Marvin Kalb and his brother Bernard and I have been friends for a very long time. We worked together as competitors, which may sound like a strange formulation, but as you've just heard, it's accurate. Working together as competitors, covering Henry Kissinger when he was Secretary of State. Dr. Kissinger has compiled a few of his own reflections about Barrie, and he asked me if I would read them to you here today, which I am privileged to do. Barrie Dunsmore and I, this is Henry Kissinger speaking now, traveled the world together nearly 50 years ago. He as the diplomatic correspondent for ABC News, I as Secretary of State. We crisscrossed the Middle East and made several trips to China. Barrie did not always agree with every diplomatic move on which he reported, but I never thought of him in adversarial terms. I regarded him above all as a colleague, a notion that seems almost inconceivable in the contemporary world. Back then, we found common ground. We dealt with the same situations and pursued the solutions of comparable dilemmas. We tried, each in our own way, to envision outcomes of which we could be proud. Barrie was always as fair as he was dedicated, and he knew his subject. I valued our conversations because he was so well informed that I could learn about many details obscured by bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo. Barrie made me proud to be his colleague. An especially memorable period during our association was in 1974, when we did a shuttle together, lasting 35 days in pursuit of an agreement that has endured to this day. That was the Syrian shuttle. In 2011, with the publication of Barrie's book, There and Back, I reflected on his contribution. And this is Henry Kissinger quoting Henry Kissinger. For 40 years, Barrie Dunsmore has been at the forefront of war, a good deal of it in the Middle East, and in the heat of the American political kitchen. He has covered the news with the insight and perspective that comes from exceptional understanding of the issues and the leaders. Equally important is his writer's eye for clarity, as well as the uses of nuance and ambiguity. This compilation of essays dating from the weeks when he accompanied me in the Mideast shuttles in the early 1970s to his commentaries on the Arab Spring will mark Dunsmore firmly as one of the significant journalists of our era. I will always think of Barrie Dunsmore, Henry Kissinger writes, with affection, as an ideal representative of a profession that is essential to the stability of this world and to our ability as citizens of that world to fulfill our hopes and realize our potential. And now, if I may, back to my own thoughts about Barrie. I was hired by ABC News in 1963. Peter Jennings came on board in '64, and then Peter brought his fellow Canadian Barrie to ABC in 1965. We were an ambitious trio who dreamed of one day making ABC fully competitive with those giants over at CBS and NBC. The three of us were good friends. But there was one lingering issue between Peter and Barrie that never became public. And I happen to know it rankled until the end. We spoke of it last only a few weeks ago. And now that both Peter and Barrie are gone, I feel free to reveal it. It dealt, and you'll have to believe me, we did not coordinate on this, but it dealt with the matter of Barrie's trench coat. Those of you wearing this button will have a chance to see that trench coat. That's the trench coat that I'm going to be talking about here. It was the classic foreign correspondence trench coat. You know the kind, with brass rings on the belt where you could hang your hand grenades for easy access. When the Berlin Wall was finally breached in 1989, Barrie was the first U.S. correspondent on the scene. That's another thing that ticked Barrie off. For some reason, Tom Brokaw got credit for being the first, but It wasn't Brokaw, it was Dunsmore. And if you go back and you look at the old nightline on which we covered the event, there is Barrie wearing his trench coat. Anyway, Peter shows up, and he's either forgotten his coat or he's got some crappy old thing that he doesn't want to wear on the air, and so he says, "Dunsmore, lend me your coat." And the next day in the New York Times, there was this review of how the networks covered that momentous occasion at the Berlin Wall, particular reference being made to how splendid Peter Jennings looked. In his elegant trench coat. There's something symbolic about that. Barrie never received the attention or the acclaim that he deserved. Full public credit for his range of talent, for his intellect, for his sense of civic responsibility, his commitment to fact-finding and the truth. He believed in good manners and was inherently kind. Still, there was in our friend, in your husband, Whitney, your father, Leanne, and Tim, and Campbell, your brother, Lorne, a seething outrage which emerged in the brilliant commentaries that he wrote in his last years. Outrage at what he perceived as the erosion of the very qualities that make America great. Barrie was, in so many respects, the very best among us. He was arguably better informed about most of the stories we covered than the rest of us. He was a more eloquent writer than the rest of us. And when it came to common decency, he'd be at the top of that list too. He was, ultimately, such a perfect Canadian. And as for sartorial elegance, let the record show that was his damn trench coat.
Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses falling. 'Tis you, must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, and when the valley's hushed and white with snow. 'Tis I'll be here in sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Danny boy, I love you so. And if you come and all the flowers are dying, if I am dead, as dead I well may be, then you will find the place where I am lying, and kneel and say, an Ave there for me. And I shall hear, though soft you tread above me, and all my grave will warmer, sweeter be. And you will bend and tell me that you love me, and I shall sleep in peace until you come to me. Oh, Danny boy, I love you so.
Does everybody know what a fulcrum is? I'm the fulcrum, upon which rests the brilliance of the preceding and the eloquence and hopefully deeply involved family sense that follows. And I'm just the guy who was barely there for a great part of the time and glad to be there the whole time, but beginning with the fact that I arrived after the onslaught of the illegal aliens from Canada had transformed American television, taking it away from Midwesterners with elegant accents and handing it over to people who didn't know how to say words that began with or ended with A, or other words that blurred out in ways only of us from Southside Virginia really know how to speak. At the same time that onslaught of illegal aliens were bringing a new breed of reporters into Washington, another onslaught of illegal aliens were coming from the South, establishing for the first time since the Civil War that it was possible for Southerners to run a government. It turns out it's not only possible, we don't know how to get rid of them now. But in the meantime, in both cases, two of us found ourselves washed up on the same shore. There was Barrie, an extraordinarily kind man, dealing with a fellow who had just become spokesman, who was greeted as spokesman by an absolutely brilliant piece of work by Tad Schultz in the New Republic, commenting on all the new figures in the Carter administration in the foreign policy field, and saying that the one that was really sort of a disgrace was Harding Carter, who was known by everyone in the press room to be the worst briefer in the history of the State Department. It was a brilliant piece of work because I had never briefed at that point. Senator Eastland had not allowed me to be confirmed, and I was sitting there with my mouth shut for 2 months. I thought it saved me in a way, because no matter how bad I was going to be thereafter, they had to watch what they said because they had been so wrong before. Barrie was, at that point, as he was to be forever, the first to come and say, "You're not really all that bad." And I felt that to be something of an elegant way to get a free drink. We were people who shared a number of things. We shared our sense, sometimes of outrage, about not being given the credit that our genius required. But we also shared a belief that it was not necessary to spend most of your time looking like a man of elegant eloquence as you strode about, whether in a large trench coat, or whether in very long hair. In either case, we knew that what mattered was the inside, and it was made much better by long evenings around the various points of call that we made. But we weren't overseas when the most important encounter with the reality of the mix between alcohol and the events of the world took place. It was Barrie's 40th birthday. And some of you were present and some of you were not. But those who were present will lie if they say they remember it, and I, who was there, do not remember it, except I know I was there. And how do I know? Because about 1 o'clock in the night, this party having been going on extensively for some time, there's a phone call from me from the communications center saying the Secretary of State wants to see you now. And I said, why? For God's sake, I'm in a party. They said, somebody's just killed our ambassador in Afghanistan. You've got to come in. I said, all right. And I staggered up from my seat, ran off to take a quick shower, and went in. As I came in, they called back and said, oh, and by the way, they've seized our embassy in Iran. I said, excuse me? This was February, the first seizure of the embassy. It happened at exactly the same time as the killing of spiked doves, which incidentally, for everybody's record, because we tend to forget what actually was happening in the world, he was killed by an encounter between Russians trying to snatch him away from Mujahideen and the Mujahideen, and who actually killed him is always subject to debate. But it was, as the Russians like to tell us, an act of kindness on their part to try to liberate our guy. I went in the next day, that night, spent the night, ran 3 briefings the next day, and I want to tell you again, not everybody was Barrie Dunsmore who was kind. After my 3rd briefing, I got a phone call from Tom Brokaw, who said, Hodding, that was the most wonderful example of real concern, and you so clearly cared about what was going on. I said, thank you very much, Tom. And so help me God, Barrie was sitting there next to me, and I said, he just told me I looked really a concerned American. And he says, Brokaw doesn't know what being hungover looks like. Well, we had a number of occasions in which the real events that my predecessors spoke about with such eloquence, and Henry Kissinger, well, I'll also admit for once, was also very right on this subject if nothing else. And we have to say, which reminds me, having just said that, I once said something like that in a briefing, and I once was caught on camera saying something like that. And the one time that Barrie did spank me, he did a little piece saying the spokesman at the State Department, Hodding Carter, is going to have to learn how not to be political when he's doing these bits, and that his job is to come out with American foreign policy and leave the politics to somebody else. And so I said, who's the somebody else? And he said, well, not you. And I said, but I am the spokesman. I mean, what do you think? It was a very nice spanking, actually, which I needed once. We were traveling at a point in which much was happening. But at home, we were not traveling when Barrie came out to eat dinner with us in Old Town. And it was a Friday. It was the Friday that the word was spreading through Washington that the Secretary of State had resigned. But it was not confirmed. But we were eating dinner, and so I said to my wife, stay home, answer the phone, and Barrie and I will go out to dinner. So we did, to a little restaurant around the corner. We had a lovely couple of hours. We came in, and he turned on his pager, and then he turned to me and said, you son of a bitch, you did not tell me that there's a story about Vance going out. And I said, no, I'm the spokesman. I'm not a news source. Now, he forgave me a month later. He was like, when we were getting on thinking about you boys in ABC overtaking, rushing after the big boys at CBS and NBC, we were in, I think maybe Cairo, I don't remember, but he was doing a last-minute stand-up. And suddenly the engines went on, overriding what he was trying to do. He came storming in at me and says, look, I know you guys don't give a damn about us. We're this little third-rate third thing, but you might at least let me finish my stand-up. I said, what were you going to say? And he said, well, I don't need to tell you that. I said, I don't need to tell you why we turned on the motor. I mean, it was a time of, it was a time in which the ordinary course of events meant that no matter where you were, something was going to happen, and in the case of the Carter administration, usually bad. But it was something that gave you a chance to sharpen up. But what always gave all of us a chance to sharpen up, listening to the singing going on here, was of an evening when overseas and all the work was over and we were now deeply into trying to decompress. We'd go out to eat together, And then if we were lucky, we hit a place, we would find a place that had a band. And then one of us would go up to the band leader, sometimes it was, well, there were several of us, and say, the great American singer is here with us. His name is Barrie Dunsmore, and you got to get him to sing. And Barrie would look down once, say, "Oh, shucks," and sing for the next hour. In these joints in various places across the world. The fact is, what was said by the three previous speakers is a fact and a certainty. It was an extraordinary group of journalists who were in that State Department group. It was an extraordinary group of journalists that who had worked with an awful lot of very good journalists in other lines of work, politics most notably, was surprised to discover that they were not only not the stuffiest guys I ever saw, they were certainly the most knowledgeable in the entire field of journalism. And beyond being knowledgeable and not stuffy, they were guys who were perfectly willing to tell you whenever necessary how you were messing up. And you know what? That's not a joke. That is really important. If you were working, both of you, supposedly for the same master, that is to say the public interest, and you are not able to deal with each other as though you were commonly the beneficiaries of the Constitution, then we are where we are right now. And the good thing was that Barrie, because we became extraordinarily close friends, was fast off the mark to tell me the times in which I seemed to be going wrong, but was not the only one. And to this day, I realize that I'm finally over my resentment for all those spankings and miss most of all the time in which it was not considered to be disreputable, dishonest, or non-professional, that there was some kind of relationship between the governors and the governed and those who covered. And Barrie, who is as noble a guy as I ever knew, was a person who repeatedly offered that lesson up to me. I have been at more weddings, various family functions, watching the Orioles get whipped, for God save us all, by Pittsburgh in a year in which we were supposed to take it all with Barrie. I've been at weddings here, there, and yon, but the wedding that matters most is the one that crosses all of these various themes. It was the one in which Whitney and Barrie got married, on a very large boat in which the whole ceremony of thereafter was held while sailing out from the harbor in a large schooner. Peter Jennings could from time to time not be the most diplomatic of people, and in his toast on behalf of the newlyweds, he said, "I have to say that I have heard repeatedly the phrase May and December, but he says, this is downright ridiculous." Your mother turned and said, "Kill him." Which happens to be true. It's great being with all y'all, in the family most of all, and I am so glad that so many of these folks had a chance to gather to say what they have said and what they're going to say, because what we were saying it about was one of, as we used to say in the South, one of nature's noblemen, and a great one. Thanks.
There are many valuable things in life, and one of those things is a long-time friendship. Somebody you've known for a long time, someone you like, someone you respect, someone you're comfortable with, someone you're always glad to see. And when someone like that leaves, part of your history goes with them. No one to say, "Remember that time? Remember this time? Remember all the fun we had?" That was my relationship with Barrie. We go back 60 years. We first met at a radio and television station in a small city in Western Canada back in the 50s, a place called Brandon, Manitoba. And we soon became friends, along with another dear friend named Donald McGowan. And in fact, we all lived in the same boarding house. And we were happy because we got jobs in an industry we dreamed of getting a job in. We were on the radio. We were on TV. Wow, imagine that. And we were a little social group along with others who worked at that TV station, and we hung out together and maybe shared a case of beer on a Saturday night. And we worked there for a while, and then Barrie and Don and I got jobs at a television station in Cornwall, Ontario, just west of Montreal, which was a very weird place. The license should never have been granted. There was no network affiliation. We had to be French all day Saturday. And they had some weird thing with a radio station, a union thing, where we couldn't write our own copy. We had to go to the radio station, pick it up, grudgingly give it to us by the radio people who hated us because we were on TV and they weren't. But it was kind of a step up. Then Donnie went off to Montreal. I went to Toronto, and Barrie came to Toronto shortly after that. Then Barrie went to the ABC network, and I eventually wound up at the ABC station in New York. And Barrie was a foreign correspondent, and he was damn good at it. Covered all the big things: shuttle diplomacy, the Berlin Wall, Vietnam. And I was proud to know him, to see him in that role. I understand now that business has gone to hell. I'm told that the ABC Bureau in London, which used to have its own building and 200 people, now it's a couple of rented rooms near Heathrow, and there's 10 people there. And Barrie saw that it was going downhill. That's why he walked away, and that's why I walked away. Barrie hated injustice, and he hated hypocrisy. If I talked to him and Donald Trump's name came up, I thought the phone was going to melt. I mean, so angered was he by this abomination. In 1968, I lived in Philadelphia, and Barrie happened to be there. So I gave a dinner party for him, and I think he had come maybe from his first trip to the Middle East. And he was asked about it, and he tore into the Israelis about the way they were mistreating the Palestinians. Most of the dinner guests were Jewish, so that didn't really play very well. One guy didn't speak to me again. But Barrie saw what he saw. He felt what he felt. And he was perfectly willing to give his opinion. Gandhi said, "Live your life as though you may go tomorrow, but continue to learn as though you may live forever." And that's what Barrie did. He studied things, he knew about things, he was interested in everything, and he had great understanding of those things that he was following. I think in his final years he was frustrated that he didn't have the outlet to share the knowledge that he had. But he had the column. And a while ago I was at a dinner in New York seated next to a woman who's in the Vermont legislature. And I heard her talking to the person next to her, quoting one of Barrie's columns. And I said, "Barrie's a friend of mine." She said, "Oh, we love the column. We all do. We look forward to it. So insightful, all that background information. It's so valuable." She liked the column. So did I. All my life that I remember, my mom had a plaque on the wall of her kitchen. And it said, "When the one great scorer comes to write against your name, he writes not that you won or lost, but how you played the game." Well, Barrie played it fairly, honestly, intelligently, with integrity. He was good at it. He was a winner. The Barrie Dunsmore that I remember was all of the things we've heard tonight. He was a professional, he was an honest guy, and he did absolutely the very, very best that he could. Barrie Dunsmore was a good man. He was an honest man, smart man, clever man. But he was something more important than that. He was a decent man. And today, when it seems to me that decency is under attack, the loss of a decent man, that's a loss to society. That's a loss to everybody. William Butler Yeats wrote, When we ask where man's glory begins and ends, I can say my glory was I had such a friend. God bless you, Barrie. I'll miss you so.
It's my distinct honor today to represent the Dunsmore family, and Brother Douglas has asked me to express some of his thoughts today as well as my own. These are Doug's thoughts. I'm grateful that Lauren is able to be present at this memorial and that he has asked me to pass on a few comments relevant to my experiences with Barrie. Being considerably younger than Barrie, I did not really get to know him until it was in my early 20s when we first interacted as adults. Barrie had left home when Doug was 8. Considering the fact that we spent nearly all our lives separate by vast distances, the times spent together were enough to forge a strong bond between us. Perhaps the principal thing that strikes me was his generosity and his kindness. 3 widely spaced instances come to mind. Just before Barrie left Regina, he bought me what I considered to be an extraordinary gift, a Lionel electric train. Believe me, in the 1950s, this was a significant gift. Although I was only 7 or 8 at the time, I loved it and still have it in my possession to pass on someday. And Doug and Grace have just had a grandchildren come into their life, so little Henry may wind up with the train. The second instance occurred when Barrie, Marlene, Tim, and Leanne were living in Rome. I was supposed to be part of a Christmas wedding, but the bride called it off a week before the wedding. Needless to say, I was floundering, but when Barrie found out, somehow he managed to get a passport into my hands, provided me with a ticket to Rome to spend a family Christmas there. I even got to attend the Canadian Ambassador's Ball with Marlene and Barrie, and the whole adventure was a wonderful, life-changing experience for me, just when I needed it the very most. Most recently, Brother Doug retired as Director of Choral Music at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. Barrie made his way up to Canada to be with me for my retirement concert and surprise retirement party. He truly celebrated what he considered to be important things in my life, and that was very significant to me, his little brother. There are countless people in his personal and professional life, and you've heard some of them today, who can add similar stories. Something I know you all will do after this service is concluded, probably long into the night. I would be remiss if I did not highlight the fact that our mother was a person of extraordinary faith. As Lauren will confirm, her beliefs led her to consistently make choices to live her life showing kindness, love, hope, and tolerance for all. I believe with all my heart that some of that is rubbed off on her sons. Further to that, I believe that the crux of Barrie's search for truth and his attempts to highlight good wherever possible was at least partially grounded in the modeling demonstrated by our mother. His obvious happiness when participating meaningfully within his church, and you've heard about that earlier, in Vermont, certainly supports that notion. From my point of view, this gifted journalist was at the core a kind, fair, and caring person. The world could use more people like him. And these are my remarks. Barrie was the second of 4 children born to Wilbur and Margaret Dunsmore. Brother Glenn died in infancy in 1937. He had a problem that we could have fixed today in 2 hours. Barrie was born in 1939 to grateful parents, followed by myself and lastly Douglas. It's not my intention to concentrate extensively about Barrie's career accomplishments. Much of that has been already covered by his colleagues. Suffice to say that from my perspective, Barrie's career was truly remarkable. My intent today is to provide a glimpse into the family environment which created this exceptional man. We were raised in a small town in Saskatchewan, and in a family where honesty and consideration of the less fortunate was paramount. Our first Regina home was bordered by railroad tracks a block north and streetcar tracks a block south with no fenced yards. Our mother reported that even as a toddler, Barrie was a wanderer, and it seemed to her that he might be destined to travel and explore. This certainly turned out to be prophetic. Our mother was a mainstay of her church, widely respected and loved in our community. She sang and played pump organ in her youth. She introduced all three of us to music, which became significant parts of our lives. Doug, of course, adopted a career and became a professor in choral music. Mother constantly encouraged her boys to provide a wonderful role model, providing that model, and measuring up to her example remains largely unattainable for all of us. Our father was very intelligent. He and his brother Trevor attended an Aboriginal school after our family lost their farm. This turned out to be a blessing as it gave the family an insight into both other cultures and the struggles that they may be encountering as well. A child of the dirty 30s, Dad left school at an early age to work and send money home to his siblings. Later in life, because of the examples he had seen, he was a person who hired non-whites and handicapped individuals for his small trucking business, and this was some 65 years before these opportunities were commonly afforded to others. This served as an important example for each of us, and it shaped our future thinking. These were values and sensitivities Barrie carried with him into his profession. As we grew older, we loudly and frequently debated politics and sports and religion at our kitchen table. If you were off track, our father would usually correct you. He challenged us to keep our facts straight, not a bad base for a future reporter. Dad always urged us to protect our good name because once sullied, it could never be reclaimed. Our parents encouraged us to be reliable and hard workers, but they were quietly and incredibly proud of their son, Barrie. My dad, who was a very quiet guy, he didn't speak to many people unless they were good friends. Barrie was coming to visit in Regina, and Dad surreptitiously had contacted the Regina newspaper to inform that Barrie would be in town. My brother probably wasn't thrilled to have his holiday interrupted, but he participated. As a youth, Barrie found his groove in high school when he was linked with music teacher Don Cowan and plunged eagerly into that field. As you've already heard, he was a singer, he was an actor, he was a saxophone player, and he became well known on campus because of his musical talents. His quartet provided paid opportunities to perform. They easily sang the music of all the popular quartets of the day. Barrie, of course, as you've also heard, he spent most of those earnings on new, and to his younger brother, me, exotic threads. Even a pair of those famous blue suede shoes, which, by the way, were hellish to keep clean, apparently. A major milestone in Barrie's young life occurred when he became a member of the Saskatchewan Golden Jubilee Choir. We were having a Golden Jubilee year in the 50s. And it was a great honor and an opportunity to see the larger world long before student travel was ubiquitous. Barrie was their male soloist. The choir went by bus to Chicago to perform on the Don McNeil Breakfast Club radio show. They also appeared at a state fair in Wisconsin and various other destinations. And then the MPs from Saskatchewan sort of caught the bug, and they put the kids all on a train, and they took them all to Ottawa. And they toured the Parliament buildings, and they were very impressed because the parliamentary dining area was off limits, and the kids had lunch there. And I talked to some of the people that he went with there who are still good friends of his. And considering the Regina of 1955, these journeys, especially the Chicago trip, were akin to a moon landing. I mean, people didn't go anywhere. So it was pretty exciting for these kids. Memories were made and friendships forged. Many choir members remain close to this day and have been in touch with Sharon and I since Barrie's passing. And in terms of the brothers, in all our years together, Barrie, Doug, and I appreciated and loved one another, and that never changed. The interesting thing is we were always thrilled with each other's accomplishments and saddened by any reversals. Each brother's success was celebrated as if our own. Barrie's generosity again comes to the fore. He knew it was my graduation for my first degree. So Barrie sent a check from overseas so I could go out and buy. He knew I played hockey a lot, and he wanted me to purchase a new CCM TAC skate, which was favored by the NHL professionals of the day. They immediately improved my skating and overall performance. I still have them. Barrie loved his 3 children deeply and only wanted the best for them. Although their father was on the road much of the time, Tim and Leanne were able to taste life in, Paris and Rome and Egypt, and they had experiences that many children could never even dream of obtaining. But of course, Marlene and the kids wanted to have Barrie at home more often, and of course he was on the road about 10 months a year. Careers in many fields interfere with family life, and certainly his constant assignments tended to disrupt theirs. Fortunately, Campbell had the opportunity to spend significant time with both Whit and Barrie when she was growing up because he was mostly retired during that time period. Barrie's immediate family, of course, expanded to include Leanne's husband, Brian, and their 2 sons, Alex and Malcolm, Tim's wife, Amy, and their daughters, Meredith and Paige. Grandpa Pop took great pleasure attending concerts, musicals, hockey games, soccer games, basketball games, and all manner of things. The grandchildren were a constant joy in his retirement. I mean, really, he loved them dearly. And as with most grandparents, he always wished for more contact. Years ago, Barrie and Whit were attending our 30th anniversary, and we had a backyard party at Regina home. And he gave a fine address, mostly praising Sharon, by the way, and charting our lives together. At the close, he said, "There's only one thing wrong with my brother Lorne." Dead silence. He thinks he's smarter than me. It occasioned much laughter at my expense, but that's how comfortable we felt as brothers. As with many of us, technology was not always Barrie's friend. And when experiencing another inevitable reversal, my brother would angrily say, You need to know the secret bloody handshake to make this damn thing work. So I think that applies to me as well, I think. Along with many, as you've heard in this assembly, Barrie was fully cognizant of the guarantees provided in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. He firmly believed the preservation of a free press is critical for the maintenance of American democracy. He regarded the current blurring of truth and scurrilous attacks on U.S. media to be highly disturbing and extremely dangerous. His stance was to be admired and respected. Barrie cared passionately about ensuring the future of our democracies and was eager to try and convince others to fight for that great cause. Today, my wife Sharon is in Regina, and she will be visiting our mother and father's graves. She will then drive out to a country church in the Coppell Valley, which is sort of a touchstone for our family. Sharon will be retracing a pilgrimage that Barrie loved to make each and every time he came home to Saskatchewan. Our mother's parents and our Aunt Muriel are interred there. The church and grounds are cared for longtime friends of our parents. It's their descendants. My brother was a critical thinker. He was bright. He was funny. He was curious and open to the many possibilities for positive change within our world. As family members, we need to celebrate a life well lived. Well done, and blessings upon you, my brother. May your spirit find freedom and joy. You'll be forever remembered and loved. And one last thing, I'd really like to thank everyone on behalf of the family for coming today and being part of this. The family really appreciates your presence. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So, as we have all humbly seen and heard throughout the service so far, and from the wonderful people sitting in this room and those watching on their computer screens, see you in there, my dad was many things to many people. He was an arbiter of truth to American news audiences. He was a valued colleague, an intellectual sparring partner to most who met him, a deep and loyal friend, a wise and noble grandfather, a generous brother, a loving husband, a compassionate son, an empathic father, and so much more. And yet what I'm realizing as I reflect back on the 26 years I was lucky enough to have him in my life, and as I continue to hear stories from his life beyond my own, it is clear that in spite of many different roles he played, he always managed to be himself, to be unequivocally Barrie. Now, I recognize the nebulous and frankly cliched nature of that concept, and to be honest, my dad is likely cringing at the thought of being described that way. But Dad, just hear me out. So I was part of Barrie's life after all of the hullabaloo that went on when he was a journalist. And when I was in the 4th grade, he was asked to speak at my small public elementary school in Vermont about the Berlin Wall. Why 4th graders were learning about that, I still don't know. He showed up in a full suit, adorned with a pocket square and a brightly colored tie, as per usual. And he had his precious piece of the wall that he had kept from the night it came down. So he sat down with me and 50 other 9-year-olds and proceeded to give the complete chronology of the wall, taking no pains to dumb down the subject matter for his audience. And I remember looking around at the faces of my fellow 4th graders, mouths agape, most of whom had likely never been spoken to like adults before and certainly had never been lectured to for 45 minutes about the politics of East and West Berlin. And, initially I was embarrassed by my dad's presence, as any other 9-year-old would be, of their parent coming to school and speaking in any capacity to their peers. But when he handed the piece of that wall to a kid in the front row and asked him to pass it around to the group, I was proud. I was proud to be raised by a man who trusted a bunch of bratty 9-year-olds with this hefty, literal piece of history. While my dad was an incredibly intelligent man, he was never patronizing when speaking to people who were not at his level of intellectual prowess. And in fact, I think he assumed most people were his intellectual equals. I never heard him knock a single person's intelligence or express he thought someone was stupid, with the exception of certain members of the House and Senate who have an R next to their name. And in conversation with me and others, he raised us up to his level. He treated us like we were on par with him, and therefore we were. Not to mention that he had a way of, as other people have mentioned, cogently and eloquently making points that were digestible and understandable to laymen about incredibly complicated topics. That was definitely useful. My father also never apologized for his passion. He was an incredibly outspoken and at times intense man of fierce morals and steel convictions. He taught me to feel strongly about the things that I cared about and not be afraid to express my opinions, no matter what the potential consequences. For example, when President Bush invaded Iraq, my dad and I had hours of discussion about the profound problems of the war, the political implications, and the whole background of the region. I was 11, and angered and moved by the actions of this executive, I decided that the next day at school, I didn't want to pledge allegiance to a flag I wasn't proud to live under. So I refused to stand for and say the Pledge of Allegiance at school. And of course, I got in trouble. It was a whole thing. But in sitting for the pledge, I was standing for something. And I came home and I relayed the anecdote of the day to my dad, and he just smiled at me. That was thanks to him. And lastly, in addition to, and sometimes in spite of his strength, my dad was warm and kind, and he was vulnerable at times and generous. And he taught me and everyone around him the importance of showing up. He always showed up for his family and his friends and his work. He showed up for the readers of his columns in his final years, even though he was ill and tired. He was present with people. He asked questions. He gave insight. He listened. And he loved and was loved so deeply. And he would be so overwhelmed with gratitude for all of you here today and all of you watching, for the fact that you showed up. So thank you. And thank you, Dad, for being you. And while you're no longer on this earth, your voice and your heart and your spirit will live within me for the rest of my days. And for that, I could not be luckier. Thank you.
So the family invites you to continue to share stories immediately following the service. Right around the corner, there will be a reception there. Let us pray. O God, our strength and our hope, giver of life and conqueror of death, we praise you with humble hearts. With faith in your great mercy and wisdom, we entrust Barrie to your eternal care. We thank you for your steadfast love for him all the days of his life. We thank you for all that he was to those of us who knew and loved him. We thank you that for Barrie all sickness and sorrow and fear are ended, and death itself has passed, and that he has entered that home where all your people gather in peace. Keep us all in communion with your faithful people in every time and every place, as together we receive your amazing grace. Amen.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangerous toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see.
And that's a take.
And so in honor of Barrie Dunsmore, go forth and be graceful in spirit, hopeful and honest in word, faithful in deed. Go forth in peace. Amen.